The fourth period of Jewish history is the Hellenistic period, which lasted from 330 to 164 BCE. During this period, what came to be called Palestine was repeatedly overrun by a series of Greek-speaking rulers. The first of these was Alexander the Great in the year 333 BCE. But Alexander soon died, and his empire was split up among his generals. After this, the land of the Jews was ruled over by the Egyptian and then the Syrian portions of Alexander's divided up empire. During this period, the Jews became very Hellenized. That is, they became very Greek in their culture, in their language, in their manners, in their literature. It was during this period that it became common for the Jews to use Greek translations of the Jewish Bible rather than the original Hebrew version of it. But they didn't become Hellenized fast enough for this king, King Antiochus IV, who died in 164 BCE. Aggravated by the stubbornness of the Jews, in the year 166 he basically outlawed Judaism and tried to force the Jews to worship the Greek god Zeus. In fact, he sacrificed a pig on the altar in their temple. And of course he chose a pig because that was a traditionally unclean animal, a ritually impure animal that the Jews were not allowed to eat or to own and raise. Here he is pictured on an actual coin from his realm. It says, King Antiochus, God manifest, bearer of victory. This led to the Maccabean Revolt, which is described in the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which are in some Christian Bibles, although not included in Jewish Bibles. In this revolt, led by Judas Maccabeus, the Jews seized Jerusalem, repurified the temple, and restored the traditional worship there as mandated in the law of Moses. This victory initiated an era of independence that lasted for almost 100 years. This is the fifth period in the history of Judaism, called the Hasmonean Kingdom. It lasted from 164 BCE to 63 BCE. This self-rule came to an end in 63 BCE, when after a civil war, the land was invaded by Rome and made into a Roman province. The sixth period, the Roman period of Jewish history, lasted for quite a while, from 63 BCE to 636 CE. Early on, this era was mostly peaceful, although often tense, because the Romans had a very different culture from the Jews and didn't really understand the Jews and could be brutal. Jesus, the Jewish founder of Christianity, lived during this era, and we know quite a lot about it because of the Christian New Testament, which was written in the 1st century CE, maybe a few parts right after that in early 2nd century. It was written mostly by Jews during the time when Christianity was in the process of separating itself from its Jewish parent. During this period, one of the Roman rulers, named Herod, renovated and expanded the temple complex, as is reconstructed in this model. But the Jews were never happy to have Roman overlords, and there was always a segment of Jewish society that wanted to revolt and kick the Romans out. First Jewish revolt started in the year 66, during the reign of Nero Caesar. In short, the revolt was unsuccessful. The emperor's general Titus captures Jerusalem and destroys the temple in the year 70 Common Era. In this picture is a decoration on the Arch of Titus monument in Rome commemorating his victory. His soldiers are carrying away the precious implements they used in worship in the temple, including this big menorah. And he really thoroughly destroyed the temple, knocking it down and burning the remains. The only bit that's left now of the Second Temple is the famous Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, and that's not part of the temple proper, but rather a part of the wall supporting the hill, a retaining wall that was part of the wider complex. The violence didn't end, though, when Jerusalem was taken. There were groups of Jewish fighters holding out. One famous incident occurred in a place called Masada in the year 74. Here there was a small group of Jewish fighters and their families holed up in a sort of hilltop fortress. As the Romans were about to break in and capture them, they all killed themselves. They preferred death to being defiled and to being forced to serve other gods. Even though the Romans crushed them, there was still some fight left in the Jews in this period. There was a second Jewish revolt led by a man named Simeon Bar Kokhba. It lasted from 132 to 135. Bar Kokhba claimed to be the Messiah. His name means son of a star, and it refers to Numbers in the Torah, chapter 24, verse 17. We'll talk about the concept of a Messiah later on, but for now, the Messiah was a special person empowered by God who was going to restore the kingdom of Israel and to usher in an era of peace. He believed that he was this God-appointed agent, this Messiah, and he was followed by more than a few Jews, including the famous Rabbi Akiba. During those couple of years, they kicked the Romans out of Jerusalem and ruled Jerusalem. They've actually found some coins from this brief reign, but they couldn't hold it. The Romans came back in force. According to Roman historian Cassius Dio, 580,000 Jews were killed, 50 fortified towns were knocked down, and 985 villages were destroyed. And some Jews were actually sent off into slavery. The Romans were merciless, and they basically outlawed Judaism for a short time, although that law lasted only from about 135 to 138. And they built pagan temples and enforced the official Roman religion and emperor worship in that area. This was the last Jewish revolt. Their religious leaders at this point adopted a conciliatory stance towards the Romans. As I mentioned, the Romans never really liked the Jews, and the Greeks before them didn't really like the Jews. They thought the Jews were strange and too exclusive in refusing to worship the traditional deities, but only worshiping this one that they alleged was the one true God, Yahweh. And here and there in the various Greek-ruled areas, and later in the Roman-ruled areas, various Jews revolted and employed tactics that we would today call terrorism. And some historians would argue that some of these cruel deeds contributed to the Greeks and Romans hating the Jews because they associated them with terrorism. Just like today, people in the West associate Islam with terrorism. This anti-Semitism, this hatred of the Jews, got passed on from the Greeks and Romans to mainstream Christianity. With the destruction of the temple, this was the end of biblical-style Judaism. There's no temple, there could be no special sacrifices and holidays and services in the temple. There was no Ark of the Covenant, no Holy of Holies. There was no lineage of priests serving in the temple anymore. That whole type of Judaism centered around temple worship came to an end. What it was replaced by was rabbinic Judaism. The leadership in Judaism was assumed by the rabbis, by religious teachers who were learned in matters of the law. From this point on, Judaism has been centered around study, specifically study of the Bible, of the Mishnah, and of the Talmud. And the temple and the priesthood are just gone. The Jews at this time were scattered around the whole Mediterranean area. Some of them had never left Babylon, and some of them went to Babylon to be with the Jews there. Another big center where Jews went was Alexandria, Egypt. In the year 330, the Roman Empire split into East and West, and Palestine, the traditional homeland of the Jews, fell under the Eastern division of the Roman Empire. Eventually, this came under Byzantine rule, which we'll talk about when we discuss the history of Christianity. This was a kingdom centered in Constantinople, today's Istanbul. But it wasn't very close to the center of the Byzantine Empire, and the empire didn't really protect it very much. And Jerusalem was sacked by the Persians in the year 614. In the next segment of this lecture, the medieval period in Judaism.